Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment before we begin to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears, soften your jaw, let the day go. Tonight we are going to travel slowly through one of the strangest stories in all of ancient history. The story of a great empire that once dominated the entire eastern Mediterranean, that fought wars on equal terms with pharaonic Egypt, that signed the world's first written peace treaty, that produced sophisticated legal codes and a substantial body of religious literature in a previously unknown language, and that then, around 3,200 years ago, vanished, more or less completely, from human memory. Vanished so thoroughly that within a few centuries of its fall, no one in the surrounding world quite remembered what it had been called, where it had been centered, or even what language its people had spoken. Vanished so thoroughly that until the very end of the 19th century after Christ, the Hittite Empire was known to historians principally as a single sentence in the Hebrew Bible, a passing reference to a people called the Hittites, neighbors of the ancient Israelites, with no clear indication of who they were or where they had come from. It is the story of the Hittites, a people who, between roughly 1700 and 1200 before the birth of Christ, ruled an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the gates of Lebanon. A people whose capital city, called Hattusa, was for several centuries one of the great urban centers of the Late Bronze Age. A people who developed, alongside the Egyptians and the Babylonians, one of the three principal great power traditions of the ancient Near East. And a people who, at the end of the Late Bronze Age, in the great catastrophe that took down most of the eastern Mediterranean civilizations of their time, simply ended. They are, in some ways, the most thoroughly forgotten of all the great ancient civilizations. The Egyptians left pyramids that no one could ignore. The Mesopotamians left enormous tells, tens of meters high, that dotted the landscape. The Greeks and Romans left a continuous literary tradition that never quite died. The Hittites left a single capital city in the central Anatolian highlands, several rock reliefs at remote ceremonial sites, a small number of references in the chronicles of their neighbors, and a vast underground archive of cuneiform tablets that remained unread, in fact unknown, for 3,000 years. Their language, their politics, their culture, their religion, all of it, for more than 3 millennia, was lost. The recovery of the Hittites is one of the most remarkable single chapters in the history of historical scholarship. It happened, almost entirely, in the 20th century. It is still, in some respects, ongoing. We are going to follow it, tonight, alongside the original story. There is no urgency to any of this. The Hittite Empire, like every empire we have ever followed in these long evenings, was built and lost at a slow, unhurried, deeply human pace. So you also do not need to hurry. You can let the names drift past, you can let the dates blur, you can fall asleep at any moment. The story will keep going, just as the Anatolian wind kept going, with or without anyone watching. It is the year 1700 before the birth of Christ. The country is the high plateau of central Anatolia, what is now central Turkey, the wide grass and steppe interior of the Asia Minor Peninsula, ringed by mountains on every side. The plateau is, in this period, sparsely populated. It is high, most of it lies above 3,000 feet, and the climate is harsh. Cold winds blow across it most of the year. Snow lies on the ground from December through March. The rivers are few and seasonal. The landscape is mostly open grassland, broken occasionally by isolated rocky outcrops and stands of oak and pine. This is the country of the early Hittites. They are not, however, the original inhabitants. The plateau, in the period before the Hittites, had been occupied for many centuries by another people called the Hattians, a non-Indo-European population whose language was apparently unrelated to anything else known. The Hattians had built small cities, including one on a rocky outcrop in north-central Anatolia called Hattusa, the city of the Hattians. They had developed a distinctive material culture, with bull and stag iconography, double-headed eagles, and a series of female deities. They had been in the region, by every available measure, since at least the 3rd millennium before Christ. Sometime in the early 2nd millennium, perhaps around 2000 before Christ, the Hattians were joined, slowly, in successive migrations, over centuries, by a new population speaking an Indo-European language. These newcomers were the ancestors of the Hittites. They were the first Indo-European speaking people to enter the historical record anywhere in the world. Their language, which they called Nesili, the language of Nessa, an early Anatolian city, was related distantly to the languages that would later become Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, and the modern European tongues. Hittite is the oldest attested member of the Indo-European language family. It is, for that single linguistic reason, one of the most important languages in the history of human linguistics. The early relationship between the incoming Indo-European speakers and the older Hattian population was, on the available evidence, gradual and largely peaceful. They merged. The Indo-European newcomers borrowed Hattian religious traditions, Hattian iconography, Hattian deities, and even the name of the principal Hattian city, Hattusa, for their own eventual capital. The merged population, which we now call the Hittites, was an Indo-European speaking elite, layered over a substantial Hattian substrate, the two populations distinguishable only with great difficulty in the archaeological record. The Hittite political tradition begins, in the formal sense, with a king named Anita, who in the early 17th century before Christ unified several smaller Anatolian kingdoms into a single state. Anita is one of the very first rulers anywhere in the world from whom we have direct first-person inscriptions in an Indo-European language. His most famous text, preserved on a clay tablet found at Hattusa, written in the Hittite cuneiform script that the early Hittites had borrowed from their Mesopotamian neighbors, describes his conquest of the city of Hattusa itself and the curse he placed on it after destroying it. "Whoever after me becomes king," Anita wrote, "and resettles Hattusa, may the storm god strike him down." The curse was, by all evidence, sincerely meant. The site of Hattusa was abandoned for several generations after Anita's destruction of it. But, as so often happens with curses, it did not, finally, take. About a century after Anita, sometime around 1650 before Christ, a new Hittite king named Hattusili rebuilt the city of Hattusa as his royal capital. He named himself, with what may or may not have been deliberate provocation, after the city itself. Hattusili simply means the man of Hattusa. Hattusili I is conventionally regarded as the founder of what historians now call the Hittite Old Kingdom. His reign, which lasted perhaps 30 years, established the basic shape of the Hittite state. He extended Hittite control across most of central Anatolia. He campaigned successfully into northern Syria. He established the Hittite annual chronicle tradition, the practice of dictating, year by year, an account of his military campaigns and political decisions, which would be preserved in the royal archives for the next 4 centuries. The Hittite annual records, although fragmentary, are one of the most extensive bodies of contemporary historical documentation surviving from the entire Bronze Age world. His grandson and adopted heir Mursili I extended the Hittite reach even further. In a famous campaign sometime around 1595 before Christ, Mursili I marched south down the Euphrates River. a journey of more than 1,000 kilometers from the Hittite heartland, and sacked the great city of Babylon, ending the first Babylonian dynasty, the dynasty of Hammurabi, whose famous law code had been promulgated some 2 centuries earlier. Mursili then withdrew, taking enormous plunder back to Hattusa. The Hittites, almost entirely outside the Mesopotamian historical tradition, had nonetheless intervened decisively in Mesopotamian political life. The Babylonian historians of subsequent centuries would remember the sack of Babylon by the Hittites as one of the great catastrophes of their history, although they were never quite clear, in those later memories, who exactly the Hittites had been. But Mursili's triumph was brief. On his return to Hattusa, he was assassinated by his own brother-in-law, who took the throne for himself. The succession, after Mursili's murder, descended into a long period of internal conflict. The Hittite Old Kingdom, which had reached its peak with Mursili's sack of Babylon, then declined, slowly, over the next century, into a fragmented and increasingly weakened state. By the early 15th century before Christ, the Hittite kingdom had been substantially reduced. Anatolian rivals encroached from the west and the south. The dynasty was weakened by repeated palace coups. The Old Kingdom, in retrospect, ended sometime around 1400 before Christ, in conditions of considerable confusion, that the surviving Hittite records, which were, after all, written by court scribes serving the contemporary kings, do not entirely clarify. What is clear is that, around 1400 before Christ, the Hittite throne passed to a king named Tudaliah I. With him begins what historians now call the Hittite New Kingdom, the great imperial phase of Hittite history. Tudaliah I and his immediate successors slowly rebuilt Hittite power. They reasserted control over central Anatolia. They reorganized the administrative system. They reformed the army. The decisive figure of the New Kingdom, however, was a king who came to the throne in the middle of the 14th century before Christ. He was Suppiluliuma I, and he was, by every measure we can apply, one of the great rulers of the late Bronze Age world. Suppiluliuma I ruled the Hittite Empire for approximately 40 years, from roughly 1340 to 1322 before Christ. He inherited, on his accession, a Hittite state that was again contracting. The Mitanni Empire in northern Mesopotamia was the dominant great power of the period. The Egyptian New Kingdom, under the late 18th dynasty, controlled most of Syria and Palestine. The Hittites were, in the early 1340s, a regional power, but not yet a great one. Suppiluliuma changed this systematically over 4 decades of careful military and diplomatic work. He defeated the Mitanni in a series of major campaigns, reducing them to a Hittite vassal state. He pushed Hittite control over most of northern Syria, including the strategic cities of Aleppo and Carchemish, both of which would remain Hittite vassal kingdoms for the next century and a half. He pushed back the Egyptian sphere of influence in the Levant, placing Hittite allied rulers in cities that had previously been Egyptian clients. By the end of his reign, the Hittite Empire was the dominant power in the entire eastern Mediterranean, comparable in scale and influence only to Egypt itself. The most extraordinary single episode in Suppiluliuma's career, however, came not through military campaign, but through a strange piece of late diplomacy. In the closing years of his reign, around 1324 before Christ, by Hittite reckoning, a letter arrived at Hattusa from the widow of an Egyptian pharaoh. The pharaoh in question was almost certainly Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb we visited in another evening's broadcast. His widow, the Queen Ankhesenamun, wrote to Suppiluliuma to request that he send one of his sons to Egypt to marry her. "I have no son," she wrote in the surviving Hittite copy of her letter. "I will not take a servant of mine to husband. Send me one of your sons. He shall become my husband, and shall be king in the land of Egypt." This was, in its diplomatic implications, one of the most extraordinary letters ever sent in the late Bronze Age. An Egyptian queen, the widow of a pharaoh, was offering to install a Hittite prince as the next king of Egypt, which would have effectively united the two great rival empires of the age in a personal union. Suppiluliuma was, the surviving texts make clear, both flattered and suspicious. He sent, eventually, his son Zananza to Egypt to investigate. Zananza was murdered before he reached the Egyptian capital. The marriage never took place. The Egyptian throne passed instead to a senior court official named I, who married Ankhesenamun himself, and became the next pharaoh. Suppiluliuma, when he received news of his son's murder, declared war on Egypt. The Hittite armies invaded Egyptian-controlled Syria, and won several major battles. They also brought back in their plunder large numbers of Egyptian prisoners, many of whom carried with them a contagious disease that they had picked up in the Egyptian camps. The plague that the prisoners brought to Hattusa would, in the next few years, kill a substantial portion of the Hittite population. Suppiluliuma himself died of the plague around 1322 before Christ. His son and successor Ramesses II inherited a kingdom whose populations were already, in that opening year, decimated. The plague years and their long demographic shadow occupied Ramesses I's entire reign and much of the reign of his son Muwatalli II. By the early 13th century before Christ, however, the Hittite Empire had recovered. Muwatalli II was, by every available measure, an effective king. He continued the Hittite expansion into northern Syria. He maintained the Hittite alliance system. He prepared his armies for what he understood would be the next major great power confrontation. That confrontation came in the spring of 1274 before Christ, at a strategic location called Kadesh, on the upper Orontes River, in what is now western Syria. The opposing army was Egyptian. It was led personally by the new pharaoh Ramesses II, the same Ramesses we met in another evening's broadcast, who had inherited from his father Seti I a vigorous program of Egyptian reconquest in Syria. Ramesses II marched north in the late spring of 1274, with what was, by the standards of the period, an enormous army, perhaps 20,000 soldiers, organized into 4 divisions, supported by chariotry and a substantial logistical train. Muwatalli II, who had been preparing for this confrontation for years, had assembled a comparable Hittite force, supplemented by allied troops from across the empire, soldiers from Anatolia, from northern Syria, from the eastern Aegean coast, from the upper Euphrates. The Hittite army was probably slightly larger than the Egyptian. It was, in chariotry, qualitatively superior. The Hittite chariot, which carried 3 men, driver, archer, and shield-bearer, instead of the Egyptian 2-man chariot, was a more substantial battlefield weapon. The battle that followed, on a hot afternoon in early June 1274, is in some ways the best documented battle of the entire Bronze Age. We have detailed accounts from both sides. The Egyptian accounts, carved on the walls of the Ramesseum and the Abu Simbel temple complex, claim a great Egyptian victory, in which Ramesses, abandoned by his troops, personally rallied the army and routed the Hittite forces. The Hittite account, preserved on a clay tablet found at Hattusa in the early 20th century, claims a great Hittite victory in which Muwatalli's chariotry shattered the Egyptian army and forced Ramesses into ignominious retreat. Modern military historians, comparing the two accounts and analyzing the actual movements that the geography would have permitted, have reached a more measured conclusion. The battle was, in actual military terms, a draw. Ramesses' army was indeed surprised and partially routed by the initial Hittite chariot attack. He did indeed personally lead a counterattack that prevented the rout from becoming a catastrophe. The Hittite forces did indeed inflict severe casualties on the Egyptians, but failed to follow through to a decisive battlefield victory. Both armies withdrew from the field, exhausted. Ramesses returned to Egypt and spent the next half-century claiming on every available temple wall that he had won. Muwatalli returned to Hattusa and, more quietly, also claimed victory. The strategic outcome, however, told a different story. After Kadesh, the Hittites had succeeded in stopping the northward Egyptian advance. The frontier between the two empires settled, more or less permanently, along a line through central Syria. The cities of Aleppo, Kadesh itself, and the smaller kingdoms of the Upper Orontes remained in Hittite hands. The cities of southern Syria and Palestine remained in Egyptian hands. Neither side could push the other further. The frontier held, with minor adjustments, for the next half-century. 16 years after Kadesh, in 1258 before Christ, the Hittite king, by then Hattusili III, who had succeeded his older brother Muwatalli II, and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, signed a formal peace treaty. It is, by general agreement, the oldest peace treaty between two major states, whose actual text has survived to the present day. We have copies in both languages. The Egyptian copy, carved in hieroglyphs on the temple walls at Karnak. The Hittite copy, preserved on clay tablets found at Hattusa, in the early 20th century after Christ. The treaty established mutual non-aggression. It established a defensive alliance. Each side promised to come to the other's aid if attacked by a third party. It established mutual extradition of fugitives. Each side promised to return political refugees to the other. It established a recognized frontier in northern Syria. It promised, in its final clauses, the personal friendship of the two royal families. The treaty held. For the next half-century, until the Hittite Empire collapsed for unrelated reasons, Egypt and Hatti maintained, by every available indication, a stable and friendly relationship. There is correspondence preserved at Hattusa between Ramesses II and various Hittite kings, letters between royal wives, exchanges of diplomatic gifts, queries about the health of relatives. The two great empires of the Late Bronze Age had moved from war to a structured peace. A copy of the Hittite text of the Kadesh Peace Treaty hangs, today, at the entrance to the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York. It is displayed there as a kind of distant ancestor of the modern international order, the first instance in human history of two sovereign states agreeing in writing to settle their differences without continuing war. It is, after 33 centuries, still legible. It is still, in its essential principles, the same kind of document that modern diplomats negotiate today. For about 70 years after the Kadesh peace, the Hittite Empire continued at the height of its power. Hattusili III ruled until about 1237 before Christ. His son Tudaliya I ruled from 1237 to 1215. Tudaliya's son Suppiluliuma II, named after his great-great-grandfather, the founder of the New Kingdom, took the throne around 1215 and ruled for at most a dozen years. And then, around 1200 before Christ, the Hittite Empire ended. We do not, even now, know precisely how. We know only that, sometime in the early 12th century before Christ, the city of Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The royal archives, the The cuneiform tablet libraries that had been accumulating for nearly 4 centuries were left where they had fallen, in burned palace storerooms. The temples were left empty. The walls were breached. The population dispersed. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the dominant great powers of the late Bronze Age world, simply ceased to exist. The same period saw the simultaneous collapse of nearly every other great civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean palace centers of mainland Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Knossos, were destroyed and abandoned at almost the same moment. The cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit most famously, with its magnificent late Bronze Age cuneiform archive, were destroyed. Cypriot copper exports collapsed. The Egyptian New Kingdom, although it survived, was significantly weakened. The Mesopotamian states retreated. The pattern of widespread, near-simultaneous collapse across most of the eastern Mediterranean and adjoining regions is what scholars now call the Bronze Age collapse. The causes of the collapse are even today intensely debated. Several factors seem to have been involved. There was a major drought, attested in paleoclimate records from the period. There were the Sea Peoples, the mysterious raiding confederations that attacked many of the affected regions, although their origins and identities remain unclear. There may have been earthquakes. There is some seismological evidence for a major series of earthquakes affecting the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century. There was probably plague. There was certainly internal political instability, exacerbated by the agricultural difficulties. For the Hittites, the picture is suggestive but not entirely clear. The latest royal correspondence preserved at Hattusa, dating to the very last years of the Empire, includes letters from Suppiluliuma II describing campaigns against the western coastal regions of Anatolia, suggesting some kind of military pressure from the west. A few documents describe famines and food shortages in the central Anatolian plateau. The final years of the empire seem to have been a period of mounting strain, on multiple fronts simultaneously, that the central government was unable to manage. What seems likely is that some combination of agricultural failure, attacks by hostile populations from outside the empire, internal political fragmentation, and possibly a final catastrophic invasion or rebellion, brought the Hittite state down within the space of perhaps a decade or two. The capital was lost. The population dispersed. The political tradition of the Hittite kings, which had run continuously for some 400 years, ended. But the Hittite cultural legacy did not, immediately, disappear. In the centuries after the fall of Hattusa, a series of smaller states in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia continued to use the Hittite language, the Hittite hieroglyphic script, and many elements of Hittite cultural tradition. These states, collectively called by modern historians the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, or sometimes the Syro-Hittite kingdoms, included Carchemish, Melid, Tabal, Quay, and several smaller polities. They flourished, in increasing isolation from any larger imperial framework, for some 400 to 500 years, after the Central Empire's collapse. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms were, in their later centuries, gradually absorbed by the rising Assyrian Empire of northern Mesopotamia. By the late 8th century before Christ, almost all of them had been conquered or reduced to Assyrian vassalage. The last Neo-Hittite kingdom, Tabal, in central Anatolia, was finally annexed by the Assyrians around 700 before Christ. After that, the Hittite political tradition was, for all practical purposes, ended. The language survived, in faint linguistic traces, in some areas. The Hittite hieroglyphic script, which is different from the cuneiform script the Hittites used for their main administrative records, and which was developed independently in Anatolia, continued to be used on a few inscriptions for several centuries. The religious traditions of the Hittites contributed, in indirect ways, to later Anatolian religious practices. But by the time the Persian Empire absorbed Anatolia in the 6th century before Christ, the Hittite identity, as a distinct cultural or political phenomenon, was gone. The Hittites after that were forgotten by everyone, except a very small number of biblical references that nobody quite knew how to interpret. For the next 2.5 millennia, the Hittites were, essentially, a name without a referent. The Hebrew Bible, in its various books, mentioned the Hittites, usually called Ha-Hitti in the Hebrew text, perhaps 50 times in passing. They were listed among the indigenous peoples of Canaan. They were noted as neighbors of Israel during the period of the Judges and the early monarchy. King David's general Uriah was identified as a Hittite. King Solomon was said to have imported chariots through Hittite intermediaries. But these biblical references gave very little context. They did not specify where the Hittites had come from, what language they had spoken, or what kind of state they had constituted. They simply appeared, in the biblical narrative, as one of the many peoples of the ancient Near East. For nearly all of the period between roughly 700 before Christ and 1800 after Christ, a span of 2,500 years, these biblical references were essentially the only knowledge anyone had about the Hittites. There were no Hittite ruins anyone could identify. There was no Hittite literature anyone could read. There was no Hittite language anyone knew of. The Hittites of the Bible were assumed, by most early modern biblical scholars, to have been a relatively minor Canaanite people, perhaps something like a small ethnic group living in the hill country of Palestine. The first hints that the historical Hittites had been something much larger came in the 19th century, with the systematic European archaeological exploration of the eastern Mediterranean. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier visited a remote site in central Anatolia called Bogazkal, about 150 kilometers east of modern Ankara, and reported the existence of an enormous walled city, with massive cyclopean masonry, monumental gateways, and rock-cut sculptural reliefs of an unfamiliar style. Texier did not know what this city was. He guessed, based on the size and the apparent age, that it might have been a Median or Persian capital. He published an account of his visit. The site of Bogazkal would, for the next half-century, remain known but unidentified. In the 1870s and 80s, the British explorer, Archibald Sayce, became increasingly interested in a series of strange hieroglyphic inscriptions that had been noted at various Anatolian and Syrian sites, at Carchemish, at Hama in Syria, at Ivriz in central Turkey. The inscriptions were in an unknown script, in an unknown language. Sayce, in a series of papers between 1876 and 1880, argued that these inscriptions were the work of a single ancient civilization. A civilization that had once dominated Anatolia and northern Syria, that had been militarily significant enough to fight wars with Egypt, and that, on the geographic and cultural evidence, was almost certainly the same people referred to as Hittites in the Hebrew Bible. Sayce called his proposed civilization by reasonable inference, the Hittite Empire. Sayce's hypothesis was, in his own time, treated with considerable skepticism. The biblical Hittites had been understood, for centuries, as a relatively minor Canaanite people. The idea that they had constituted, instead, a great Anatolian empire of comparable scale to the Egyptian and Babylonian was, on its face, surprising. The decisive confirmation came at the very turn of the 20th century. In 1906, a German archaeological expedition led by Hugo Winkler began systematic excavations at Bogazkal. Within weeks, they had identified the site, as the location of a major ancient capital city. By the end of 1906, they had begun finding the cuneiform tablet archives in the burned ruins of the royal palace. The tablets, when first read, included diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, with Mesopotamia, with the Mycenaean Greek kingdoms, the whole great power network of the Late Bronze Age. They included treaties, they included royal annals, they included lists of kings. Bogaskale was Hattusa. The unknown empire of Sayce's hypothesis was, in fact, larger than even Sayce had imagined. The Hittites had not been a minor Canaanite tribe, they had been one of the great empires of the second millennium before Christ. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Hattusa presented an immediate and remarkable problem. The writing system on most of them was Mesopotamian cuneiform, which had been deciphered in the early 19th century. But the language being written in the cuneiform was, in most cases, not any known language. It was, clearly, an Indo-European language. Its grammatical structures, its noun declensions, its verb conjugations were recognizably Indo-European in pattern. But it was Indo-European of a kind that had never been seen before. It was older than Sanskrit. It was older than Mycenaean Greek. It was, in fact, the oldest attested Indo-European language anywhere in the world. The decipherment of Hittite was undertaken by a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný, working in Vienna during the First World War. Hrozný, in a famous paper published in 1915 entitled The Solution of the Hittite Problem, demonstrated that the language of the Hittite tablets was indeed Indo-European, related to Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, although significantly more archaic than any of them. He identified key vocabulary items by comparison with known Indo-European cognates. He worked out the basic grammatical patterns. He published, in the years after, a series of further studies that established the foundations of modern Hittitology. The key sentence that broke the language, in Hrozny's account, was a Hittite phrase that read, "Nu ninda an ezateni, watarma ekuteni." Hrozny recognized two of the words. Ninda was a logogram, used in Mesopotamian cuneiform to mean bread, and the suffix, an on it, was a recognizably Indo-European accusative case ending. Water was, plainly and obviously, the Indo-European word for water, preserved in modern German Wasser, and English water, and many other languages. Ezateni and ekuteni were verbs that, by their endings, looked Indo-European. Hrozny proposed that the sentence meant, now you eat bread, and you drink water. He was, on the actual translation, exactly right. From that single sentence, the entire grammatical structure of Hittite was, in principle, accessible. The full reconstruction of Hittite occupied much of the 20th century. Successive generations of scholars based first in Germany, then in the United States, then increasingly internationally, worked through the enormous Hittite tablet corpus. By the most recent estimates, over 30,000 fragments, of which perhaps 10,000 are substantially complete. They reconstructed, from these tablets, the full diplomatic correspondence of the Hittite Empire, the chronicles of its kings, its legal codes, its treaties, its religious texts, its mythological narratives. The Hittite legal code, in particular, has become one of the most studied bodies of ancient legal material in the world. It is, alongside Hammurabi's code, one of the two principal early systems of written law that survive from the ancient Near East. It is, in some important respects, more sophisticated than Hammurabi's code. It distinguishes between intentional and accidental offenses. It generally prefers compensation to physical retaliation. It has provisions protecting minors and slaves. It is, although still alien in many of its specifics, recognizably a piece of legal reasoning, rather than mere royal decree. The Hittite religion, as it has been reconstructed from the Hattusa tablets, was extraordinarily complex. It is sometimes called, by modern historians, the religion of 1,000 gods, an exaggeration, but not by much. The Hittites worshipped an enormous number of deities. They had inherited from the older Hattian substrate the original storm god Taru and the sun goddess Wuru Semu. They had adopted from the Hurrian populations of northern Mesopotamia and Syria an entire second pantheon: the storm god Teshub, the goddess Hebat, the warrior god Sharuma. They had imported, from the Mesopotamian tradition, additional gods like Ea and Ishtar and Sin. They had absorbed, from the Indo-European tradition, the sky god Sin, cognate with Greek Zeus and Roman Iove. They had taken, from the Anatolian populations they had conquered, the patron deities of every conquered city. The result was a pantheon of literally thousands of named deities, organized into a complex theological hierarchy. The royal religious ceremonies which the king was personally responsible for performing involved the systematic propitiation of large numbers of these deities, in particular sequence, on particular days, with particular offerings. The Hittite ritual texts that survive describe these ceremonies in extraordinary detail: what to offer, what to say, what to wear, what gestures to make. There is, in some of these texts, a quiet sense of the strain that this enormous pantheon placed on the people responsible for managing it. The kings, who personally performed the central state ceremonies, were chronically anxious about whether they were correctly identifying and propitiating all the relevant deities. There are surviving Hittite prayers, in which kings ask, with apparent sincere distress, whether some misfortune that has befallen the kingdom, a plague, a military defeat, a poor harvest, might have been caused by the inadvertent neglect of some particular minor god, whose name the king had forgotten, or whose proper offering he had failed to provide. The famous plague prayers of Ramesses II, written during the long plague years that followed Suppiluliuma's death, are some of the most remarkable pieces of personal religious writing surviving from the ancient world. They show a king genuinely puzzling, on the page, over what divine offense he might have committed, and how he might possibly atone for it. The systematic excavation of Hattusa has continued, more or less without interruption, since Winkler's first season in 1906. The German Archaeological Institute has run the excavation since the founding of modern Turkey in the 1920s. New tablets are still being found. New buildings are still being mapped. The site, today, is one of the most thoroughly excavated archaeological sites in the world. A walk through Hattusa, on a clear morning, is one of the most evocative experiences any archaeological site can offer. The city occupies a long hilly ridge overlooking a small river valley. The lower city, where the ordinary residential quarters once stood, is now mostly grass and scrub, with the foundations of houses and small temples picked out in low stone walls. The upper city, where the great temples and the royal palace once stood, is more dramatic: substantial stone foundations, ramparts, processional ways. The famous Lion Gate, with its monumental cyclopean stone lions guarding the southern entrance to the city, is still standing. The Sphinx Gate, on the southwestern wall, is largely intact, with the original Sphinx sculptures replaced by replicas. The originals are in museums in Istanbul and Berlin. The Yerkapi, an enormous artificial earth rampart on the southern approach to the city, is still there. 800 meters long, 12 meters high, faced with cut stone, with a postern gate at its center, and a long stone ramp leading up its sloping face. About 2 kilometers from Hattusa proper is a site called Yazili Kaya, the inscribed rock. It is an open-air rock sanctuary. a natural rock formation enclosed by ancient walls, with the walls of the surrounding rock cliffs carved with relief sculptures of the principal Hittite deities. The Yazilikaya reliefs are, by general agreement, among the most beautiful pieces of Hittite art surviving anywhere. They show, in long processions, the Hittite gods marching toward each other in formal greeting. They are clearly cut, surprisingly well preserved, set in a small grassy clearing surrounded by oak forest. To stand in the small open chamber of Yazilikaya on a cool autumn afternoon is to be in the presence, as much as such a thing is ever possible, of the religious imagination of a vanished civilization. The Hittite tablets, now distributed among museums in Turkey, Germany, and several other countries, continue to be studied. New translations are still being published. Several of the most important diplomatic texts, the Kadesh Treaty, the correspondence with Egypt, the Plague Prayers, the Apology of Hattusa III, have, by now, been translated into multiple modern languages and reach a wide academic and educated lay readership. The Hittites, who were almost completely forgotten for 3,000 years, are, in the early 21st century, more thoroughly known than they have been at any point since the fall of Hattusa. It is worth pausing before we close to consider what was actually lost in the long forgetting of the Hittite Empire, and what would have been different if the forgetting had not occurred. In one sense, of course, very little was lost. The Hittite Empire had collapsed in the late 12th century before Christ. Its political institutions had ended. The languages and cultures of the surviving regional populations gradually evolved into the various Anatolian peoples of the Iron Age: Phrygians, Lydians, Lycians, Carians, none of whom maintained much continuity with the Hittite tradition. The Hittite cultural legacy, in any direct institutional sense, was minor. There is no major modern institution, anywhere, whose lineage can be traced specifically to the Hittites in the way that Roman law can be traced to the Roman Empire, or that Christian ritual can be traced to the late Roman Church. In another sense, however, the Hittite recovery has profoundly changed our understanding of human history. We now know that Indo-European-speaking peoples were already established as a major civilizational force in the Eastern Mediterranean by the 2nd millennium before Christ, much earlier than had been previously recognized. We now know that the great power system of the Late Bronze Age was a multipolar one, with Hittites, Egyptians, and Babylonians all operating as comparable major players, with sophisticated diplomatic correspondence and formal treaty relations. We now know that international law, in its earliest written form, dates back not to Greek philosophical speculation in the 5th century before Christ, but to actual functioning treaties between Bronze Age states more than 1,000 years earlier. We also have, in the Hittite religious texts, the earliest sustained body of Indo-European religious thought anywhere. Comparative mythologists have used the Hittite material to reconstruct, in reasonable detail, the deep religious vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral language from which Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, and so many other languages all derive. The Hittite divine names, when compared with their cognates in later Indo-European traditions, have been crucial for understanding the deep religious heritage of the entire Indo-European speaking world. In short, the recovery of the Hittites has not changed any specific modern institution, but it has substantially deepened our knowledge of the ancient roots of much of modern human civilization. The ancient world, which seemed for centuries to have been a duality of Egyptian Mesopotamian Eastern civilization opposed to nascent Greek Western civilization, turns out to have been something far more complex, a multipolar system of great powers, in which the Hittites occupied a distinct and fascinating place, and in which the deep ancestors of modern European peoples were already, by 1200 before Christ, fully present and politically consequential. We have come to the end of our story. It has been, by simple span, a story of about 2,000 years, from the early Hittite settlements on the Anatolian Plateau, around 2000 before Christ, through the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom, the Great Wars with Egypt, the Bronze Age collapse, the Neo-Hittite Afterlife, and the long forgetting that lasted from the 7th century before Christ until the early 20th century after. It is, in the long perspective of human history, one of the most dramatic single examples of a great civilization rising, falling, vanishing, and being slowly recovered through patient archaeological and philological work over the course of a single century. The Hittite Plateau today is one of the more unchanged parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Modern Turkey is, of course, a thoroughly modern country. But the central Anatolian highlands, beyond the major cities, are still mostly empty, still mostly cold and high and windswept. The villages are small. The wheat fields are still rotated against fallow seasons. The shepherds still drive their flocks along the same long migratory paths between summer and winter pastures that the early Hittite settlers would have recognized. The cold wind still blows across the plateau in the long October afternoons with a quiet relentlessness that has not changed in 3,000 years. The cities the Hittites built are mostly gone. Hattusa is a ruin. The other major Hittite centers, the ones we know of, like Tarsa or Tarsus, like Sapinua, like Ortakoi, are also archaeological sites, with greater or lesser degrees of excavation. The Hittite language is read only by a small international community of specialist scholars. The Hittite religion is understood only by historians of comparative ancient religion. The Hittite political tradition has, in the strict sense, no living descendants. But the Hittite tablets are still being read. The Hittite kings, 3,000 years after their deaths, still have voices. Mursili I's plague prayers are still discussed in seminar rooms. The Apology of Hattusili III is still studied. The Kadesh Treaty hangs at the United Nations. And on the cold high Anatolian plateau, on a clear morning, you can still walk through the gates of Hattusa, between the Cyclopean stones, and stand in the great processional plaza, and look out across the same valley that the Hittite kings looked across, in their own particular cold mornings, 3,000 years ago. We are at the end now. Take a moment, if you are still awake, to soften your shoulders, to unclench your jaw, to let the day, again, go. If you are not still awake, that, perhaps, is the better outcome. We did not promise you a history. We promised you a sleep. The history was simply the carriage in which the sleep arrived. In a moment this will end, there will be silence, the music will fade, then, in another moment, this will begin again, for the next listener somewhere else, in another quiet evening. The history, like the cold wind on the plateau, does not end. It only continues, in some other room. We are very glad you came, we are very glad you stayed, we hope you sleep deeply, and well. Good night. From the Drowsy Historian.